You become chief accountant.
That's right.
In November of 1956. Do you remember anything about that episode when you, perhaps about...
Pretty clearly fixed in my mind is why it was done. Earl had what he thought was enough, and they were considering selecting someone to replace him. We had invitations to 2 professional meetings in Seattle, and the news that Earl wanted to leave the commission came to me when I was out there. I think the Accounting Association and the CPAs all met in Seattle at the same time, but with a gap of 3 weeks in between.
Okay.
I used the 3 weeks to go to Alaska.
Oh,
we had a very fine tour of Alaska.
So when he announces his resignation, was there a selection process, or was it, with all the experience you had at the commission, by that time you had been at the commission, almost 20 years.
Yeah.
And clearly you had had experience outside the commission's office in public practice and education. It'd be pretty hard to find somebody. I'm not familiar with all the people on the staff at that moment, but it sounded to me like you were the pretty obvious successor. Was there a formal search? Or?
There were others that had far more public practice as a public accountant.
That's true.
Because I was only in that position for 2 years. But one thing that Scoville did for me, hirement did out here, was to advise me to go to a smaller firm than the Big 8 were. You get more variety, wider experience, different problems. If I went to a firm like Gore, well, so did Gore merge with it. I think he merged with the...
I'm not sure.
Wellington.
Yeah, it could very well be.
Anyway, he was one of the stalwarts in the profession in Chicago at the time.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, often college professors, or up to today, will occasionally find young recruiters from some of the major firms who are very aggressive, who come in and particularly say to professors, well, you know, every firm has its own story, but occasionally, in my capacity in working with smaller practice units, they accuse accounting professors of steering, you know, just to the big firms. I know my own experience has kind of been like yours. Every individual has their own talents, and depending on what their interests are, they may bloom more readily in a smaller practice unit. Major firms aren't necessarily for everybody. That doesn't mean eventually you may not end up with a major firm. Carmen Blau ended up being a partner in, I believe, Anderson after his SEC experience and before he went to the Institute. And so you may end up intersecting with a major firm some other time in your career, but where you start ought to be where your interests are. And that's interesting that Professor Scoville here at Illinois made those comments.
Well, Professor Scoville, I think, was a very fine man. He and Littleton, Philby, approve of him.
Yeah.
Made a nucleus for building up the accounting work at the county in Urbana.
Now, you have a photograph up on your bookshelf. Is that some of the faculty?
Those are graduate notice there.
I don't know how well that may photograph.
That is a picture that appeared in the Daily Illini. I saw it. I was, I don't know what year it was. Must have been about the time I went to the commission. But anyway, I put it on the door while I was at the place in my offices. And there was a group came in, the usual council group, executive of the corporation. And one of us, he came in the door and glanced at this thing. He said, "Who are all these jokers with Henry J. Kaiser?"
Well, I think he mistook.
Which one is Henry J. Kaiser?
Well, the one in the second row center, is that who you thought was Kaiser?
Yes, that's Slaughter.
That's Slaughter, yeah. Slaughter, the cost accounting professor.
I had all of the others, the cost accounting, Bailey down in one corner. This is the one I had, the cost accounting. Slaughter was just beginning to get some
Notoriety.
stature
Yeah.
in the field, and then of course his son did too.
Yes, he did. Professor Benninger at Florida, when I was doing my doctoral work at Florida, Professor Benninger was someone who would bring out Slaughter's texts, and we'd occasionally critique them and look at them. That's true. So the Illinois faculty were a prime ingredient in your preparation. I think that's probably something we
My
would
mother scouted around, got a hold of Stoll, and asked if he had a picture. Of course, I got it. So we could use of it. You can see my history is spread around this room. Everything hanging on the walls or resting on the top of a shelf is some section of my life's history.
Well, we know the military part is here.
You know?
One thing we haven't mentioned, although we probably should, is that in 1980, you mentioned Illinois, when Norton Bedford was department head and Vern Zimmerman was, I believe, dean at the time.
Yes.
Through their combined efforts, your collected writings were published under the Written Contributions of Selected Accounting Practitioners, Volume 3. I think it's important to recognize that using the technology of the moment and having the opportunity to do a video interview, a conversation with Andy, just begins to focus on the real depth of the materials that you would find by looking at the particular papers. And a little bit later in our conversation, we're going to talk about some of the papers that are in the volume, because they kind of emphasize his contributions in the areas of independence, in the matter of the investment tax credit, and of course a summary paper at the end, which Andy and Paul Grady presented in 1979 at the Southeastern AAA meetings. All part of understanding the development not only of Andy's contributions, but the profession surrounding it.
The other
You were
two,
mentioning
one
that
and two were up there.
Volume 1 and 2 are Ralph Johns and Paul Grady's collections. That's right.
They were practically contemporaries of mine. Grady was in the same class, and John's about 2 classes later.
You mentioned that there are a number of items around the room that here in your apartment that are significant of your achievement, and while Dale is panning the cameras, we may not be able to quite get to everything, but on the wall there is your President's Award from 1960, and I believe that was awarded to you by President Eisenhower.
On the recommendation of the SEC.
And that's that particular award was given in March of 1960. That's, I guess, another example of how you distinguished yourself during those years at the Commission. Maybe it's time to maybe shift back and talk a little bit about technical issues here, and I'll get my note cards up to date because we've moved kind of quickly.